While the ancient Greeks attained for their time the highest level of treatment of diseases, and it should be emphasized, quite effective treatment, many methods and ways of healing can cause bafflement and dismay. The prevailing view at that time was that all diseases were sent by the gods, so often the sick were taken at night to the temple of the god Asclepius, the giver of cures. It was believed that at night the daughters of the deity Hygeia, from her name came the word hygiene, and panacea, and today a lot of people know the word panacea, would come with snakes and heal those who were in pain. The topic of this episode is obscure and creepy medicine of ancient Greece. You're watching Flip Side of History, and we welcome you on our channel. Let's start at the beginning. The ancient Greeks did not have a medical system as a whole, but there were methods and experiences that differed depending on where they lived, how they lived, and what their gender was. Interestingly, that absolutely any person who had acquired some understanding of healing could call himself a doctor back then. From there, the self-proclaimed therapist would simply seek out patients. Appropriately, the methods of treatment were often quite devastating. But for the sake of justice, we must admit that because of the constant wars between the various Greek regions, doctors learned quite well how to treat injuries and bones fractures, and later began to observe patients and collect herbs, rightly believing that no one would cure the wounded better than nature. Unique methods of dealing with illnesses. It's not so much sinister as it is simply ridiculous how they treated, for one example, venereal diseases. In order to protect against infection, the Greeks used to smear their genitals with oil before the intercourse. But if the infection had already appeared, they treated it either with aromatic baths or by exercising and dieting. But Saturn Ephesius recommended that all those who were affected carry lead weights tied to their feet. As strange as it sounds, the universally accepted cure for all diseases was to drain the blood. The Greeks, and not only them, were strongly convinced that it was necessary to drain the sick blood, and then the body would feel relief. It was especially common to use bloodletting if the patient had a terrible fever. While even today's medicine recognizes that blood must sometimes be renewed, such drastic methods in ancient times could often lead to the death of the patient. In this case, it was believed that the gods had decided that this is the sick person's fate, and one could not argue with the gods. Besides, to enhance the effect of the medicine, men who were sick were advised to do gymnastics and sing. Of course, those who were suffering from a toothache had no time to sing. And here Greek doctors were categorical. If a tooth has pain, it should be cauterized. And if it did not help to cauterize it, it should be extracted without any other options. Also, besides blood, the ancient Greeks recommended that patients in general periodically renew their body fluids and get rid of unnecessary ones. So inducing vomiting or diarrhea was considered a normal medical way to get rid of something bad. But the thing is that many of the failures in specifying methods of treating diseases were due to the beliefs of the Greeks themselves. Thus, doctors believed that a girl was an underdeveloped boy who simply had certain organs that had not come out. In ancient Greece, they were totally sure that the same teeth grow throughout a whole human life, and that the milk teeth are formed by the mother's breast milk. So it is not unusual that along with quite funny and amusing, there were downright terrifying ways of treatment. Creepy ways of healing. For instance, the Greeks would burn herpes on the lips with a burning iron, which certainly did not help anything, but could increase the likelihood of additional infection entering the body with a high degree of confidence. Surgical operations were conducted by Greek doctors, but this was considered an extreme method, after which death was very likely to occur. As a matter of fact, this is how it actually happened. The opening operations were done without the necessary level of sterile environment, so the most frequent result was the death of the patient either from painful shock or from infections. Yet the most unexpected and simultaneously terrifying were the methods used to treat women in general and women's illnesses in particular. It must be underlined at the very outset that the doctor had no right to even examine women, but simply listened to the symptoms and gave a verdict. Using the core principle that there are 4 basic fluids in the body, Greek medics treated very heavy menstrual periods in women with a blood draw. The logic was pretty simple. If there was a lot of blood, it meant it was in excess and consequently needed to be drained. Most of the time, of course, patients simply died from such treatment. The latter misconception stems from the fact that, as previously explained, girls were considered to be underdeveloped boys. The Greek doctors were accordingly convinced that the woman had a constant and great desire for intimacy. And since this was the truth, intimacy could also be a form of therapy. That is why fairly often doctors recommended that women spend more time with the men in a private room, in an attempt to get rid of the sickness, In this case, the notion of orgasm was not even considered. The whole process alone was considered medical. It was believed that if there was a lack of intimacy, a woman's uterus would begin to, so to speak, wander through her body, leading to a preterm birth. So in seeking to put the uterus back in its proper place, the Greek doctors recommended using the principle of a woman's impurity. Since it was not clean, it had to be treated accordingly. And to bring the uterus back in its place, the diseased person was placed on her belly with regular animal feces. The uterus was supposed to smell and return to the right place. If a woman had a miscarriage, she was given a healing drink, a solution of mule excrement and wine, to help her recovery. It is not known how effective this method of rehabilitation was, but it is clear and obvious that nothing good could be expected from this sort of method. But the creepiest were the ways of defining pregnancy. The ancient Greeks believed that a woman had a lot of empty space inside of her, so to diagnose pregnancy they often did the following. A whole peeled head of onion wrapped in a cloth would be placed inside the woman for the night. In the morning, the woman had to breathe. If her breath reeked of onions, she was not pregnant. Well, why? Because when pregnant, the uterus swells up and does not allow the smell from below to reach the top. Whether this is actually the case is left to anyone's interpretation. The second crazy way to prove pregnancy was no less strange and downright creepy. In front of the woman's face, they started to rub a red stone into dust. If the dust did settle on the woman's eye whites, it was considered a clear proof of pregnancy. Speaking of which, doctors never had the right to assist women in childbirth. It was believed that it should be done either by the woman herself or by a specially trained mistress or a nanny. Paradoxically, special instructions were even written for such nurturers on how to deliver babies successfully. At the same time, doctors even deemed it beneath their dignity to speak to them in the first place. The famous Hippocrates believed that if the baby came out incorrectly, not head first, then it should be cut open right inside the baby and pulled out the remaining pieces with the forceps. At the same exact time, special women were also successful in such wrong kinds of childbirths. However, Hippocrates also saw it as beneath his dignity to clarify such details. The doctors could appear at the birth only if the woman in labor was actually in bad shape, and also if the woman in labor died without giving birth. The doctor could also save the baby. According to a Greek legend, it was thanks to a caesarean operation on a dead mother that Asclepius, who later became the god of medicine and healing, was rescued. And it is odd today, but it was logical at the time that medicines for men and women were radically different. Since a woman, let us repeat, was considered unclean from the very birth, she was treated with potions with almost unavoidable excrement. Dirt as cure. Everybody knows that the Greeks were seriously interested in sporting activities. Before training, men covered their bodies with olive oil. During training, the athlete would sweat, the oil would mix with sweat and additionally with the sand that was put on the floor of the training arena. And after that, the really gross, the shocking, the surprising, and the impossible began. Once the training was over, the men used a special bronze scraper to clean the skin from the mixture of oil, sweat, and scent. This frankly bad-smelling composition was meticulously collected by healers. And incredible as it may appear, it was later used as an external agent to treat certain outward inflammations and infections. It might have seemed that nothing good could be expected from such a procedure. It was not until almost near the end of the 20th century that it was discovered that certain kinds of viruses called bacteriophages lived in these nasty mixtures. And one of the main abilities of bacteriophages is the successful annihilation of skin infections, for one example. And they themselves are not much inferior to a lot of modern antibiotics in terms of their efficiency. Healing snakes. As we have mentioned before, the sick were taken at night to the temple of Asclepius, where the sick were supposedly healed during the darkness of the night. But the most famous temple was Asclepius in Epidaurus. The sick streamed there from all over ancient Greece. There were basically two ways to get rid of the illness. First, a figurine was placed in the temple, a model of a diseased organ with the patient's name engraved on it. The Greeks thought that the sculpture would help the sick organ to heal by being filled with energy. The second, quite disputed and plainly strange, was the way of lying with the snakes. Since snakes were considered the companions of both the god of healing and his daughters, snakes resided everywhere in the temples of Asclepius. The sick, entering the temple at night, would lie still and the snakes would crawl over them. It was believed that snakes were also able to help to get rid of sicknesses. However, not everyone was allowed to enter such a temple. Priests were very anxious about the purity of energy, so the terminally ill were not allowed in the temple. Otherwise, the death within the walls of the temple would pollute it. Thank you for watching our episode. Subscribe, leave a like, and expect new episodes on Flip Side of History.